Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. Lesson 2 of Interpersonal Neurosynchrony, or to give it its full title for the first time, because this was a work in progress, this is Covert and Conversational Hypnosis, Influence, Persuasion, Negotiation, Rapid Seduction, and NLP Mind Control Secrets for Therapeutic Change, Pleasure and Profit, and in truth a whole bunch of other areas as well. You could say it's subtitled The Art and Science of Effective Communication, and of course it's presented as always by myself, Alex William Smith by birth, but better known to many of you as Dr. Jonathan Royle, hypnotist, and my partner in crime, depending on which way the video goes, the man himself who was indeed trained by many of the three-letter, you know what I mean, governmental type agencies and whatnot, Mr. Paul Gutteridge. How are you doing, Paul?
Very well, thank you. Alex, also known as Jonathan, and any other name you may go by. I thought that was just my world, but you do it as well, so I'm cool.
Oh, Christ, I've had so many names over the years, especially when I was working as an undercover journalist for various newspapers, which is, well, I thought today I would wear the some people just need a pat on the back t-shirt, because what we're talking about is nudging people into our way of thinking. And I thought I'd use the library background in the main, because later on we're going to talk about storytelling. Just a couple of things I want to quickly get out of the way that tie into last time. When I looked at my notes from lesson 1, I realised, oh, you idiot, you didn't say that. Meaning me, I'm the idiot.
Oh, it might have been me as well. I've been known to be that.
So what I want to mention is, I want to mention this guy. Okay, now,
hello.
I'm not sure if his face is going to show up on there. No, it's unfortunately, you will have an image of this inside with this lesson. This is a picture of a French guy, no longer with us, called Baron Etienne Felix de Henning de Covillers. Now, the reason for mentioning him is that we talked about transitional sleep, the theta state, and where the midpoint of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system is, one being the relaxation end and pleasure, and the other being pain, stress. But those relating, interlinking with the theta state, transitional sleep period, hypnopompic, hypnagogic. Well, a lot of people in the hypno world believe incorrectly that a guy called James Braid coined the term hypnosis and hypnotism and the other HYP prefixes in 1843, circa 1843, in a book that came out then by James Braid. And that is incorrect. It was actually coined in 1820 by Baron Etienne Felix de Henning de Covillers. And there's two great books on the subject for anyone who is interested in the history of things. One is called The True Creator of Hypnosis by Remy Coote, R-E-M-I, Remy Coote, C-O-T-E. And the other one's called Demystifying Hypnosis by Scott Allerton. You can also find a Hypnosis Week episode on my Celebrity Hypnotist YouTube channel in the playlist under Hypnosis Week, where I talk about the Demystifying Hypnosis books and the True Creator of Hypnosis book, and give you the background on, in a fuller level, on Baron Etienne Felix de Henning de Covillers, the True Creator of Hypnosis. The reason I mention this is because ultimately he used the word hypnosis, hypnotism, the HYP prefixes in 1820, some 20 to 23 years earlier than James Braid. And whether you agree with him or not, as he was the person who coined these terms, the simple fact is whatever he meant them to be, what he intended them to be, is what they really mean. Yes, we're all entitled to give our own meanings to things, but the fact is he created the terms and he gave them meaning. And the meaning he gave them, as far as I can tell from everything I've read, is that what he termed hypnosis was, and I'm so delighted because it ties in with what I've been saying for years, is the transitional sleep state, i.e., that is akin to hypnagogic, hypnopompic that we spoke about in lesson 1. So therefore, when we talk about covert hypnosis and conversational hypnosis in this lesson and other lessons, we are talking about nudging people into either the stress, pain, fear end of the scale, so that there's critical faculty, analytical area, executive function bypass, or we are talking about getting them into the relaxation response, theta, trance, pleasure area where the focus is so much there that you've got your critical faculty, analytical area bypass, which ultimately, either direction, generally speaking, can be achieved through sensory overload, confusion, disorientation. It's just a difference between whether that's, some would argue, in a positive sense or a negative sense. At least that's the context I'll be speaking in, and to a degree, I'm fairly certain that'll be pretty much akin with what Paul will be sharing. So I mention that because if hypnosis does exist, I say it doesn't, it's purely suggestion, it exists only in the mind of the believer. But if it does, as far as I'm concerned, we have to go with what the creator of the terms called it to be, namely that transitional hypnagogic, hypnopompic theta in the relaxed or stressed mid-zone where the critical faculty analytical area is bypassed. And coincidentally, some may say, I wouldn't, I'd say it's probably because it's right, they do jigsaw together and link together perfectly. When you get so many coincidences, I don't think there can be coincidences anymore. I think it's because there's actually something in it. What's your thoughts on that before we get kicked off properly, Paul?
No, I have not. I confess I have not studied hypnosis to the level that you've studied it. However, I am aware of the raging debate of state-based or non-state-based, etc., around hypnosis. So let's ground it in some of the stuff that I've done, and bits and bobs that I may still do. So when people like me approach somebody, we want them to be in a state of either extreme focus on what we want them to focus on, or extreme defocus, which is the corollary, away from something that they don't want to see, we don't want them to see or hear. So
they're not in the middle. So I would randomly throw in the word there. In the middle is central, is balance. So you want them unbalanced one way or the other.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. That is a good way of putting it, because basically when somebody is either hyper focused and they perceive they're in control, they are actually not. I actually want them to be, when somebody's in an extreme state of focus, I want them to be slightly emotional. And emotion is energy in motion. I want their energy to be moving somewhere. And I want them to be moving in the direction I want them to be moving. And so let's really grind it out. So I remember one of the jobs I did was working for a certain customs and excise team in another country. And, I was having chats with people in airports, and I wanted them to be so defocused on something and so focused on something, they'll be more likely to slip and give me information as to whether they were carrying contraband from one country to another, for argument's sake. And then I get on the plane with them, look like one of the punters in travel and all that kind of jazz. And what we're seeking to do is we're seeking to get them into using certain linguistic skills, using props if necessary, And what you brought up earlier on, when you look at stimuli overload, so you can knock a glass over, you can make a noise, because at that point, somebody's in a state of readiness and hyper alert, and therefore they're more suggestible, which I suppose comes back to the hypnosis thing. So somebody's
And
more
NLP
suggestible.
calls it a pattern interrupt.
Well, what a great phrase, a pattern interrupt. So they're in this, there's a pattern interrupt, there's something that's taken place. And of course, you triggered their limbic system, which then renders the logic center of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, high rational, critical faculty, all that jazz comes offline just long enough for us to start to do and seed and open and use humor and whatever. So I suppose that's in a different setting and in another type of real world setting, the way that this stuff works around focus and defocus and arousal and then suggestion into that. From what I understand from wherever we're at in the raging debate on hypnosis, actually we want to get people to do that. And then you couple the authority, you couple confidence with that, you couple, hey, I am the hypnotist or the therapist or the sales individual, the authority on X, Y, and Z. It's just a massive amplifier to help people move from A to B. And again, you can use it with good intention and you can use it for nefarious purposes, depending on how you're wired and what you want to achieve, I suppose.
Nefarious purposes. This is not meant to be. This is more from an informational, educational point of view, and for people to protect themselves, but to be aware of. Although, with positive intent, the same principles can be used because it's like a hammer. Kill people, put nails in, pull them out. As you said about the intention. What I'm going to include in this section of the course is there will be a PDF with some other links in. And one of them will be to a video called 8 Steps to Cult Indoctrination, where I explain the 8 steps used by cults to indoctrinate people into them. And arguably, that cult could be as extreme as a cult, the way you think of it, Scientology, or some might say certain religious sects. That also goes into a thing called Lifton's thought reform techniques, which are covered in that video, where, but just to bullet point it, the 8 points, which are explained in more depth with examples in the video that will come with this lesson, of cult indoctrination, how cults suck ordinary people in. Step 1, identify the potential recruit, the target. Step 2, persuade the recruit or target to walk into the web. Now, that has illusion and deception tends to be used. So it may seem innocent, a self-help group, a retreat, relationship therapy, a church, a business meeting, an evening class, the context, the environment will be safe. That's the key takeaway. Will feel safe to the individual and non-threatening, so that they can therefore relax and let their barriers down and get to a point where over-analysis and logic goes out of the window and they become emotionally involved and connected into things, which is then amplified by step 3, love bombing, which is where they give loads of affection, make the person feel loved, wanted, needed, all the things that I mentioned in the 4-hour video that came with lesson 1 about how it all truly works. Well, in cults, it's called love bombing, to make that person feel really valued and special, so that they feel that a sense of belonging, being wanted and appreciated and whatnot. Step 4, sell, sell, sell. Well, this is where the other cult members, and at this stage they may not have all revealed themselves to be cult members, because there might be 3 or 4 of them infiltrating a genuine self-help thing to recruit people away. But those apparently independent people will together manipulate, social engineering, some would call it, situations where they are seen to be successful and happy, or to have had a positive life change because of following the ethos or beliefs or teachings of that particular group or society or sect or religion or business philosophy hierarchy. Could you notice I'm chucking other words in here? Although it's about cults, it's all adaptable to all other areas of life when you look at the bigger picture. Step 5, tough love. Now, this in the seduction arena, PUA, pickup artist, this is the idea that you show a bit of interest in a woman or a man or both. Doesn't matter whatever your sexuality or gender. But the idea is that then you back off. And also you might, what they call in seduction, neg them. Backhanded comment. So the person then feels, they like me one moment, now they don't. And their natural instinct as a human being is want to feel appreciated again. So they will try and fight for your affection and approval. And that's kind of what tough love is in cults. So then everything's all been nice, and then suddenly they'll push you away and you have to earn. But by so doing, you're getting yourself deeper down the rabbit hole because you're making more of a commitment. Step 6 in cults is that they tend to get at that point get you to, well, if you're really committed, you've got to cut off these family or these friends. Or in a business deal, it might be show your commitment. If we're going to do that, you need to do X, Y, Z as well, where they drag it in more. Step 7, the introduction of core beliefs. That's namely the cult's beliefs or the business ethos that they want you to follow from there on in. But at this point, the critical faculty has been bypassed. You made too much of a commitment. You've been dragged in, as it were. And then step 8 is zero tolerance of criticism. So anyone who criticizes the cult or the businesses, anyone in the workplace who might criticize the boss is sacked. Anyone in the cult who even raises the smallest question is thrown out and ostracized. And Day of the 8 cult, there's a lot more to it than that, which is why there is a 60-minute video included with this lesson to go into it in more detail. But I saw you making notes as I mentioned those things, Paul, and it triggering off things. So I'm going to open the stage to you, because I'm sure that you've seen overlaps there with social engineering in every day.
Loads. And, so I get asked to work with various individuals, and let's take a hypothetical situation. You've got some wealthy individuals who whose children are children of well-known or wealthy people. They're going to go traveling for a year. There are people with, let's use that word, nefarious intent, that will use many of these techniques in order to get information out of, solicit whatever, take advantage, ingratiate themselves to the children of the wealthy parents in order to fulfill a longer game plan. And I get asked sometimes to talk to them about what are the conversational and psychological elicitation techniques that such people will use, but more importantly, how do you mitigate against them? And it's the mitigation stuff, which is really simple in some respects. You got to have your wits about you. And unfortunately, you've got to have in mind that this may well happen. And therefore, how do I prepare myself for it? So that's that mental rehearsal. That's that thinking of, okay, I'm going out tonight. It's a new, unfamiliar place. I've done all my security stuff, etc. But what about my psychology? What about my mindset as I go out? And it's this fine line between enjoying life and thinking everybody's out to get me. And in some respects, people will say, oh, well, what do you think about brainwashing, Paul? And I said, well, really, everybody's being brainwashed. It just depends who you're allowed to do the washing, so it's like, so how do we prepare ourselves without becoming really cynical? So you were throwing stuff out, you got negging in there. And so I talk to these guys a lot about how do you develop a posture of ego suspension in life without being a walkover? How do you suspend your ego at different moments so that if somebody does if somebody runs a neg at you, if somebody does this, that, and the other, you're not rising up because you're triggering the limbic system. Oh, I've been negged, or whatever phraseology we want to use. And we want to know, and we want to come back because it meets a fundamental human need of wanting to be loved, liked, appreciated, and all the wonderful stuff you phrase it as well. It triggers that desire. So how do you control that, or slow the internal clock and the emotional clock down to say, here, hang on a minute, I don't have to respond to that. I know who I am, whose I am, what I'm about, and therefore I can make decisions. Now, if we're not doing that beforehand, we're going to fall for it, and I do as well, because my emotional brain is faster than my logical brain. And people like to pride themselves saying, oh no, but I'm really logical, I'd never fall for such things because I'm all sorted out. Newsflash. People get emotional about being logical. Emotion is the thing that is driving these things. So we need to be prepped. So that's why, the stuff we're talking about over this course and all the other bits and bobs that you've done as well, help give us, okay, that's how it works. Okay, I'm going to get got sometimes for sure, but actually let's slow it down and really think this through. So now I'm a bit prepared. But those 8 things, I was scribbling notes thinking, oh, I've seen that. I mean, I've been subject to things where people have been running certain strategies against me, and I've nearly fallen for them and thought, I'm in a car park in another country in a car with some other people, and I've actually walked into something. How do I get out? It's that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Bloody hell.
Yes, bloody hellfire, as they say up north.
Yeah. Crikey. So, with that mentioned, because that bonus is in this lesson, what I want to, we'll see how we go time-wise. I've got so many other notes here, but things we don't cover today, we'll cover in the next lesson. Fear not, people. I want to cover stories, hence the visual imagery, and the importance of stories and the power of storytelling, and how it captures people's imaginations, how the unconscious, subconscious mind, or personal net or computer, call it what you will, works on visual imagery, which is why we did mention in the intro, we talked briefly about the fact that, that's why mimetic warfare, online psyops they will make images go viral, that your funny image with a few words underneath. And these things are actually being used, weaponized, to make people, nudge people into different ways of thinking, because they understand that the mind works with images. The image captures consciously, they go, oh, nice cute puppy, for example, and while you're focused on that, your critical faculty analytical area, think, oh, I can go for a coffee break, nothing dangerous to see here, but the words underneath can just go boom into the unconscious.
Yeah.
Distraction. Also the fact of storytelling, and storytelling implies that there's a lack of truth. Now, obviously, it can be telling a true story, which would be like an autobiography, or supposedly news, although in my personal experience, the vast majority of news that you read in mainstream media publications, such as those published by the likes of the Rupert Murdoch, or your Daily Fail, like from Dacre, or things like that, at best have a small element of truth that's distorted and amplified so that they can sell newspapers or get viewing figures. Hence, in the media industry, there's the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, because the more traumatic or extreme sounding the story, the more it engages instantly the viewers or the reader's emotions, bypassing any critical analysis instantly because of that fear impact or that shock impact. And thus, then the imagery they use, again, if it bleeds, it leads. So imagine extremeness, is more likely to capture the imagination and make the person want to read more, buy the paper, or watch the news, blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately, when it comes to the news, I'm not going to waste time here going into it, but if anyone wants to learn more about my background and the time I spent as an undercover journalist, and attempted in 1998 to expose Rupert Murdoch's now disgraced fake sheikh Mazir Mahmood, which backfired with me, ending up with a short prison sentence that's still in the process of being appealed. And I currently, as we record this on the 22nd of August 2023, have a case filed in my birth name, Alex William Smith, against News Group newspapers in the High Court of England, because I've obtained evidence of them hacking my phone, drugging me with date rape drugs, fabricating evidence, and a whole bunch of other things that, yes, do go on. I know it firsthand. So when I talk about storytelling and news, I'm not saying it's necessarily true. In fact, not all stories are true, but there is a power with them. And this goes back to fairy tales. And a book I want to make people aware of is there we go. The Witch Must Die, it's called. The Hidden Meaning of Fairy Tales by Sheldon Cashton. Now, I'm not saying you have to go and read this. I'm going to give you a brief overview. But if you want to have a sort of historical background, this goes into different fairy tales, everything from the Three Little Pigs. Give you an example from the headings at the front. The Witch Within, the Sleeping Beauties. Next chapter, Vanity, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. Gluttony, Where Breadcrumbs Lead. Envy, If the Slipper Fits. Cinderella, obviously. Objects That Love. Deceit, Spinning Tales, Weaving Lies. Lust, A Tale of the Sea. Greed, The Beanstalk's Bounty. Sloth, Gibetto's Dream, Pinocchio. Inside Oz, Off to See the Wizard. It goes into different fairy tales that have been around in different forms around the world for years. And it explains the cultural significance and the underlying narrative. And I believe that understanding this is a very useful thing. Throw it over to you. There's other things I want to say, but I'll leave them for later.
Yeah, I mean, these memes, all the stuff you're talking about, there's good research on that. You know, Dyer in 2000 and early 2000s did for, I think it was Routledge that published it. He talked about the on images, the use of images and memes in psychological influence and persuasion. But actually, you know, even boiling it right down to how using story in everyday situations. So say, for example, when people think about story, they might think about, you know, using the things that you're talking about there, reading that book and saying, actually, there are universal stories and images that run in the depths of humanity. Enter Carl Gustav Jung. But there's also the story of
archetypes, as he refers to them.
100%. And there's also the story of actually what's our story right here, right now. So let's make it super practical. So let me give you a classic. I'm in an airport. I'm wanting to talk to somebody who is a person of interest. How do I approach them? Now, actually, although I'm an introvert, and even when I'm extrovert, I'm a bit cool. In other words, I don't like to step over boundaries. So stories help me hook and give me confidence to communicate with somebody. So I slip into a role, I approach somebody at an airport, and I create a shared story. And it could be something as simple as this. God, I tell you what, the handles on these bags don't have to cut your fingers, don't they? And now I'm making a story. I'm creating a shared story. In that moment, my story is this handle hurts, and I'm putting them into the story, myself into their story, because they're dragging the bag along. And they can say yes or no. It doesn't matter as long as they start talking, because now I've used story to enter into their world. Gavin de Becker calls it forced teaming, using an everyday thing that we relate to, creating a narrative around that, which is a fancy name for story. And that creates the hook in somebody, because when I approach with story, gosh, this bag hurts like mad, or this plastic handle's cut in, or gosh, is it just me, or is it really hot in here? What about the aircon? Or what I'm doing is I'm just using an everyday situation to create a narrative and or a story without even getting more sophisticated. And all that does is it gets people talking. I want emotion, energy, emotion, and people start talking. And then by very definition, as soon as somebody opens, I'm of no threat when I'm telling a story. It reduces the threat level because people end up what we call third partying. So if I can get somebody to say, oh yeah, I can understand that you're having a difficult time with your bag, or somebody else is having a difficult time, they've already removed themselves from the critical faculty. Yeah, there's no threat. They've created some distance. And to your point earlier on, arguably, it's created some destabilization. They've moved in a direction I want them to move in, and therefore we can get the conversation going. And that can work in elicitation, asset recruitment, selling, convincing. We use story in order to reduce resistance, create connection, and then help move somebody from A to B. So that's on the simple stuff around plastic bags. Amazing where you can go with plastic bags and handles.
Well, let's be honest, I mean, all advertising. Well, I say all, the vast majority is effective storytelling, whether it's the television advert that tells the story that apparently, you know, no offense to anyone, but let's say, you know, ugly, not particularly good looking bloke, but ends up getting laid with the really fit model just because he sprayed on a certain deodorant or aftershave. This story is played out visually, because then emotionally people can observe it and go, oh, I better buy that aftershave, because they're not buying the aftershave, they're buying the idea of getting laid with someone that's way out their league.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was working, not of that, happily married many, many years. I thought I'd better put that in case my wife watches this, which she probably won't. What do you do, Paul? I'm not interested in what you do. I was working in a country in Europe that's known to be quite logical. And I was working with a team out there, and this guy says to me, all this storytelling and this emotional triggering is a load of beep, 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 beep. And I said to him, I reckon you tell yourself a story every day. You tell yourself multiple stories, multiple narratives that define who you are, how you are, and what you're going to do, and how you make decisions, yes or no. Well, yeah, whatever. And I said, you may tell it to yourself in a logical, linear fashion, but let me just ask you some questions. So I just asked him some questions. And basically, I was eliciting his values, which is the deepest story about right and wrong and should I and shouldn't I that we tell ourselves, that we sort of picture frame, we look at the world through. And I know that once you get to values on elicitation, it's probably the same in certain areas of therapy as well. Once you get to meaning, purpose, values, and all that, once you start to touch that, that's incredibly powerful for creating change. So I was mucking about with him. I got him to stand up. There's about 15 of us in the room, and I'm asking him these questions. And anyway, I purposely start to cut across his values, rubbish basically the story he tells himself. It's not just the fairy tale. It's not just the plastic bag shared story. It's the deep personal narrative that we have about ourselves. And I'm really logical or whatever. And I thought I'd elicit all those, and then I'd start to cut across them, like debunking them, making them sound rubbish, whether I believed it or not. And do you know what? A logical, straight-laced, I would never be touched by any of this crap poor person ends up getting so angry, he pulls out a knife, a pocket knife that he had in the session, and wiggles it in my face. He said, "You piece of rah," and he's gone. So I have to do my Jedi mind tricks. You do not want to do that. EMDR, follow my finger. Let's get that memory process. You're struggling, boy. But you know, even that stuff is, joking aside, when we go, hey, be careful, we're actually doing bilateral movement. That's for another day. But actually, he loses it because why? Because his own story is being challenged. And yet one of his stories is, I'm really invested in being logical. I'm emotional about being non-emotional. It was great fun, Jonathan.
Oxymoron. Yeah.
Super powerful though. We can use it all the time. We're telling ourselves stories, big metaphors, memes, narratives, shopping bag, force teaming, personal narrative. It's all a story. And once we can elicit that, we create movement, emotion, we create emotion. and we can help move people along. As long as we don't get them so triggered and they shut down or go defensive and go from flight into fight mode. And once we're there, there are ways to actually provide, I call it, name it, frame it, move it, how we actually deal with outbursts of emotion. I suppose in a therapy or hypnosis world, it would be called an abreaction. How we verbally handle that for a client or a suspect or a subject or whatever, to actually give it some safety, so that then the affect of that can go down and we can carry on with whatever thing we're doing. But it's stories, everything. And if we learn how to elicit the values or the bigger narrative, you could do incredible things. Advertising is the example.
Advertising, and of course, therapy arena at heart, suggestions as effective ones are stories. And I'm not talking Milton Erickson, the bloody incompetent, sick, twisted, so-called godfather of conversational.
So you have an opinion on Milton Erickson?
Inside my elite hypnosis boot camp, there's a training set called the biology of hypnosis, and in there I present all the evidence that Erickson was a bullshitting, lying, narcissistic pervert who, by his own words and volitions, used to take psychiatric patients and lean them at the wall at 45-degree angles by their head in stress positions because he found it amusing. He mentions this in his own magazine that he published, and he brags about things. He brags that taking him, like, for example, 6 hours to get somebody to make a change that a competent hypnotist using stuff I teach in the boot camp could do in 5-10 minutes. He brags that because he didn't use any formal hypnotic induction, the person wasn't aware of what's going on, that the fact it took 6 hours is a good thing. Now, I call that incompetence, not knowing what you're doing. I'm sure that'll upset some hypnotypes.
I'm sure it will.
But if it has, tough luck. The truth's the truth, and the evidence is in that set. The point being, Lo, there is still a truth that telling a story in the right manner can trigger emotions, as you said, and because it bypasses the critical faculty, analytic layer, executive function, can go directly into the unconscious, subconscious, desktop computer, as it were, and because the mind doesn't know the difference between, the unconscious doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality, as is shown by MLQA's law of reversed effort. What resists persists in NLP. You get more of what you focus on and whatnot. All of which, incidentally, within this package, I'm going to be giving people for free access to the Master Practitioners NLP training course manuals and training slides and whatnot to expand on these NLP terms they'll have heard us mentioning, and also so they can learn how to apply them in other ways. But stories can, two major things that occur to me. One is that, because we don't know the difference between imagination and reality, is that if that story is weaved in a certain manner with a parable, like the Bible, a hidden meaning, then it becomes so-called covert conversational suggestion or hypnosis, call it what you will. And the other is that stories appeal to our, Jung will call it the child archetype. Eric Byrne, author of Games People Play, and the figurehead of transactional analysis, would call it the child ego state. There's various different labels for it in different camps, but it all kind of heads back to this idea that we are all have part of us, that would be parts therapy, that there's part of us that is still a child and always is. Whether we choose to recognize that or not doesn't remove from the fact that it is arguably true. And as I talk about in the boot camp, and I talk about if you go to my Celebrity Hypnotist YouTube channel and click on playlists and then click on podcasts, I do interviews for my book Hypnosis, helping you get over the shit in your life and get your shit together, which I'll give people in this course a copy of anyway. But in those podcasts, I talk about how we all, from birth, Sigmund Freud, and Carl Gustav Jung, or sometimes Jung I call him, so it's Freud and Jung, talked about the formative years, Freud in particular. Now, he said that those were from 0 to 7. I personally have extended that and believe and teach the idea that it's from birth until around, roughly, give or take, it's a bit different for each individual, but around the start of the teenage years, puberty. And this ties in with the evidence that shows the executive function of the brain, which can arguably also be called the critical faculty or analytical area, doesn't kick in and start working properly until around the teenage puberty years, which is why I argue that the formative years, because there is no critical faculty, analytical area, executive function doing an active role, is actually up to that coming on board and starting its job as the nightclub doorman of the mind. So is around puberty, teenage years. So therefore, in turn, a lot to unpack here, and I'll be really interested in how you apply or don't this in your world, is that knowing this, we know that up until around the teenage years, people do not have that analytical critical faculty filter. So obviously people of that younger age we would deal with differently. But also we know that up to that point, they are going to be also experiencing traumas, part of growing up, because the critical faculty is not there to stop them, help them avoid things. So they're going to encounter a whole bunch of stuff and not be able to analyze it perhaps in the way they would when those things kick in. Now, I am not saying, when I say traumas, I don't necessarily mean that they've been abused as a child or physically attacked, although that will be an extreme trauma to us from an adult perspective. But prior to the critical faculty analytical stuff kicking in at teenage puberty sort of age, we all have, whether we like it or not, lots of mini traumas. And what I'll give you an example of a mini trauma. Imagine there's a child, a baby, maybe 18 months old, 2 years old, at a birthday party, and the balloons have come out and they're all over the floor, and they see there's one green balloon and they're really attracted to this. So they crawl forward and they get the green balloon. As they pick up that green balloon in their imagination, which is ultimately their major state of mind as a child, because there is no critical analysis. So, you know, imagination and reality, there is no difference at that point. In that second, this is no longer a green balloon. It's now a magical fairy castle kingdom. And this castle's filled with hundreds of magical fairies. And in that moment that the child is loving this and waving at the little fairies, a parent walks past and accidentally knocks their back, and the child falls forward onto the balloon and it bursts. And the parents, when the child starts crying, think it's because the child's fallen on the balloon and the loud noise, the bang. And yeah, that may be a contributory element to scaring the crap out of them, affecting the limbic system, as it were. However, do you know what? Arguably more traumatic than that is in that moment, the magical fairy kingdom castle got destroyed.
Yeah, okay.
And the magical fairies got killed. To that 2-year-old in this example, that is as traumatic to them in that moment, their world of reality, as it would be for us as an adult losing a loved one or family member in a car crash. Yeah. And it gets filed as such in the unconscious, subconscious mind, the personal net computer, where it remains, because it's got nothing to stop it going in, because the executive function, critical faculty, analytical area is not coming on board till around teenage years, puberty. Yeah. And there's loads of events in life that, as an adult, looking back on them, you'd go, really? A balloon popping at a party when you two could still be causing me shit now as an adult? And you go, that's laughable. It's ridiculous. But I'm telling you, in my experience with therapy, we've all had dozens, if not hundreds, of what I call mini traumas from an adult perspective. But as the child, whether 2 years old, 6 years old, or even 10 years old, before that critical faculty kicks in, the traumatic effect, as perceived by the individual, is far greater than we'd ever think of it now as an adult. But that's how it's been logged, and it's running as a program on the personal laptop computer, the unconscious subconscious mind. So it's no wonder people end up feeling scared in certain situations or not feeling good enough, blah, 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 or it manifesting, because when the critical faculty, analytical area, executive function kicks in at puberty, thereabouts, then they do start having this protective filter, unless somebody like us comes along and causes disorientation or confusion or shock or fear, or uses an important seeming ritualistic process to fixate their attention on one thing to the exclusion of others so that we can bypass it to get in. And there's nothing wrong with that when it's done with consent and cooperation. It's only nefarious when it's done without the person knowing that's what's going on. So at that point then, you think everything's fine, but it isn't, because there's already that negative stuff in there that's running. So a therapist's job, as well as perhaps helping the person get rid of their phobia or habit or addiction, whilst there are things they can do to help with that, and let's take post-traumatic stress disorder. The person presenting may say it's because it's the result of having been raped or the result of being in the war zone. And whilst that will indeed be true, the way in which they have handled it, or as yet not fully handled it in an effective manner, has to some degree been affected or infected by the way their computer was running when these things occurred. So the culmination of all these mini traumas from birth to sort of teenage years. So part of the effective process is to bypass the critical faculty analytical area and help release those mini traumas that may not be directly connected to the PTSD or CPTSD that's being dealt with now, but to release those mini traumas. And the best way of doing that is to metaphorically heal the inner child, because the inner child is the one that hasn't fully processed those things, which is why I use an important seeming ritualistic process of getting people to imagine, well, genuinely holding a cushion or a pillow, and with their eyes closed and having gone through some meditative state, imagine that that's holding the mini them when they were younger, and take them through the different ages and have them imagine saying to the mini them, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. I'm here for you now. Everything's going to be okay. And as daft as that might sound, it helps release those traumas. So the computer, then it's like removing the viruses from the computer so that it can run more freely. It then makes it easier to deal with the actual presenting issue that the client's got, because otherwise you deal with the client's presenting the issue in the therapy. I know I'm giving a therapy example here, but this applies in other areas of life, can do as well. You can deal with it, and yeah, they overcome that habit, addiction, fear, or phobia, or they've got over their PTSD. But if they're still running negative programs and mini traumas from the past on the laptop computer, at some point, kind of as a cry for help, the unconscious subconscious will make them manifest. In therapy, it's called symptom substitution, in some other way as a cry for help.
Yeah.
And I found the most effective way to deal with it positively, permanently, and rapidly is to help them metaphorically heal the inner child. Jung would call it the child archetype. Eric Byrne, Games People Play, Transactional Analysis, refer to it as the child ego state, because he talks about parent, adult, child. If you want to learn more about that, read Games People Play by Eric Byrne. And I think that's something worth mentioning. I'd be really interested in what that's triggered off and sparked in you, Paul.
I think there's two broad things. There's because I'm involved with a bit of the sort of the coaching, therapeutic type of coaching, because of the people I've knocked around with. There's lots of trauma, big T, little t, PTSD, etc., anxiety, hyper, whatever. But then on the other side as well, which is talking to people, what is being classed here as conversational hypnosis. How do you get in? Knowing some of how the brain works and the processing that you're talking about, obviously it's critically important for how we do interventions and work with people on the coachy therapeutic and, dare I say, hypnosis side of things as well. But actually knowing how that process works when you're engaging people one-to-one, whatever your work is, whether it's selling, influencing, persuading, or like the real sharp end, I suppose, which is around how do you elicit information from somebody, how do you work an asset, a target, or whatever. I think the nub of what you're saying around how the brain works and how we encode information and trauma works in both those settings. So let me speak from the non-therapy side of things.
Yeah, please do.
When it comes to what you're phrasing as conversational hypnosis. So that's why guys and girls. So you had Chase Hughes on one of your podcasts. Now, Chase Hughes, former CIA guy, super duper good at loads of different bits and pieces. He will listen to people like you. And he said that on his podcast, on the podcast, I remember right. He will hunt people out who are involved with therapy and hypnosis and mentalism. The reason being is because people like me, it expands our minds in terms of, oh, these are psychological principles that may be gamed or in a sort of stage performance, or psychological principles that work in a therapeutic context. But they're just psychological principles that work with human beings. That's the one common denominator. You just put different wrapping paper and accoutrements around it and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, they're still the same things that are working. So when it comes to the conversational side of things, which some of our viewers are going to be interested in as well, how do you use what we know about how the brain codes information, deals with trauma, big T, small t, and all that kind of stuff in with storytelling? How do we get people those conversations going? And I would say one of the things that I find people struggle with is, how do I even start? Because if I know that story works, if I know that, critical faculty is not developed until a certain age, and therefore we are primed for story before we became primed for other things, and that's the deepest sentiment. But we come across people with lots of crusts and layers on them. And those crusts might be, I don't do story because I'm a grown up. And other people are more familiar with, oh yeah, I love a story. I love a.
And yet those people who watch soap operas every week, or a Netflix drama series, their stories, it's just in a different perceived context.
No, that's exactly it. So when I'm working with people and training people, I would say to them, because we will talk about story, we will talk about metaphor. How do you get quickly get emotion? How do you trigger the emotional center of the brain to create ownership so you can create energy through emotion? How do you do that? And I would say one of the things that you can do very practically is in your early conversation with somebody, if it's in business or wherever you find yourself, let's take a business setting, a selling setting. When you're asking somebody to just say, hey, what did you do over the weekend, or the general chit chat, you can listen for the structure of how somebody answers that question. Now, if they answer that question in a very linear fashion, we did this, then we did this, then we did this, then we did this, you know that a straight out attack with a story is not going to work, because they're starting with what before the why, and how does that apply, and the what if. So when we think about psychodynamics, all that kind of stuff, and we think about Jung's Myers-Briggs, we think about disc profiling, we think about all these, think about things that help us work out our personality based on dichotomy. Are you introvert or extrovert? Well, I'm more that than that. It's a sliding scale. Do you look at detail or do you look at big picture? Okay, you're going to be both, but you're more that end than that end. So what we're trying to do is saying that when people are really logical and linear, I know that they're more what than story. So they want to know the bottom line. So the way I segue into the story is I will, if I'm communicating with them, because I've heard they're structural in how they answer my question in the chit chat, how do you do the weekend? I will start with, this is what we're going to do. This is what the product achieves. I need to get that knocked off to satisfy in them the logical, perceived logical element. Now they feel safe, seen, heard, understood, comfortable, all that kind of stuff. And then they're more likely to be open to, so what if? Well, let me paint a picture for you about how this could work. Then we're into story. Alternatively, if I'm talking to somebody, how was your weekend? Oh, it was magnificent. We did all these things. I just felt great, actually. And we saw this person and we were talking about all sorts of things in the past. And they're telling me a story. Then I know that my entrance point in conversational hypnosis for some of our viewers, or selling or whatever, is going to be, actually, do you know what? I had quite a weekend myself. And then I tell a story. So now we're aligned. So, and the difference between the two is, one's from this world called the analytical, the Z decision-making model in Myers-Briggs typology, which you start with what and how, and then you move through to the more fluffy stuff, as some people would call it, at the other end. The other one, starting with why, is more around what they call the format model, which is a learning pedagogy, a way that we learn based on why, and then what if and how, and all that kind of stuff. So you start with story and then you go through to the specifics. And knowing that's super helpful. And that little shortcut is, if somebody gives you line by line, bang, 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 they're not story primarily, or you've got to get past that. So give them the what, the outcome of the conversation from a sales perspective, then get to the story. If they're more story, paint them the story and then go to the what specifics at the end. That's your shortcut. The second thing is, I often find that once we've, and I teach this when I'm working with people in terms of how do you get to yes effectively? That's William Urey's stuff from Harvard. How do you get to yes? Oftentimes in situations, and I've got loads more, but I'll shut up to give you a chance to breathe and share. But people often set their expectations, or they don't set their expectations. So say, for example, you're talking to somebody in a sales setting. You've got to ask yourself the question beforehand: is this conversation about me closing, or is this conversation about me getting a next meeting? Knowing that and setting that as an expectation, because once you've embedded the story and you've got the intrigue and the emotion, where do you want to go with it? And sometimes, because we haven't got that defined, we don't know what to do. So we overreach and mess up and lose confidence. And I say to people, look, set your expectation of where you want it to go. And once you've reached it, enjoy the rest of the conversation. So for argument's sake, if you're in a networking situation for those small business owners, your goal is to get the next meeting or the referral. That's it. It's not to close in that situation necessarily. Once you've got there, stop. Because then it's slick, it's done, it's good. You've known whether to enter with linear to story or straight into story. Once you've got the ask is, let's exchange numbers so we can meet, or pick up the phone, or grab a coffee for a meeting, you stop there. And once people know how to set their expectation, they have a tremendous amount more confidence in whatever context they go into, because they're not overreaching and therefore feeling, I don't know what to do with this stimuli that's come in. No, be calm, cool, and collected. Once you've reached your threshold, pull back and then move on. There are other things that we can do with this story stuff and metaphor, and how to trigger, and actually and I will finish with this, ultimately you can engineer mini trauma in situations to create destabilization. And that's around stimuli, that's around cognitive overload, whatever it is. We're basically unsettling people so they're more open to the suggestion. Now that's at another level. And how do you observe that? How do you see when people are beginning to dissociate in a situation? And that will often happen in their breathing rate, the way they hold their gaze. And you know that you can go in and do certain things in that setting to create change. But that's way beyond what we just need to cover just at this moment of, this is how you use story. We can talk about that other stuff as well.
Indeed. So I have a book recommendation for viewers and listeners. I get no commission of recommending any of these books. I want to make that clear. However, I'm going to take the background off just for 1 second. So
that's a huge book.
It is indeed. And it is a book that I have written the foreword for. It's called Constellation Experience Frameworks. I've done that the wrong way around. The Art of Hypnotic Episodic Storytelling, a training manual for crafting long-form, compelling narratives for influence, by Joseph Crown. You can get this on Amazon. It is, as you can see, a large format encyclopedic book of like nearly 400 pages. It's bloody massive, and it's not dear. I forget how much it is, but I mean, in English money, it's just a little bit over 20 quid. It's really good value for money. I wrote the foreword for it. That's how I've managed. It's only just recently been released, but that, having seen it in advance, I would say if you want to learn about, well, the things we're about to talk about, you want to learn more about stories, whether it's short ones like parables you would find in the Bible, a couple of paragraphs long, but they've got a hidden meaning, or a longer story that might be considered like a shaggy ghost story you might tell at a Halloween party, or something that, you know, you can get your message across because you're telling the story of the customer who had great results with the product that you're mentioning or whatever. So it's like relating the third parties. Whatever, this book, excellent value for money, and it will cover in more depth things that we're going to be talking about, which I've got the bullet points for in front of me. But the first one is parables. The short story, the Bible being a good example of hiding either hidden meanings or making it slightly less obvious than directly in your face. Some stories are very transparent, some are more hidden, and parables tend to be a little bit more hidden. Hence, you'll get a minister in church, for example, elaborating from one parable a full service, giving a more meaning and depth to it. And I know that this is not to ram religion down anyone's throat, because we already said in the intro, thank God I'm an atheist. I know that you yourself have a faith, and I totally respect that. But because of that, that gives you a unique insight as well. And I would like to touch on that a little bit. So let's start off with, I'm using that word, parables, and the way narrative's used in religion and how that relates into other things.
Yeah. Oh yeah, parables are huge. I mean, there was a saying amongst the rabbis that in each parable there were 70 layers of meaning. And the understanding was that parables are living. They're not just set positional truths on X, because they deal with the imagination. And from all I've read around, and applied around the world of hypnosis, etc., to get people to go inside to create meaning, actually the brain is phenomenal, and the mind encodes stuff both in the head and somatically across the body as well. And it can organize itself. It's quite astonishing how we've been put together. And so parables are really important. Parables provide the opportunity for the rewriting of a personal narrative by reducing the threat level as well to the target, if we're using that language, by saying, actually, you might have heard it said, ba, 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 then the story comes out, but I say, ba, 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 ba. And then basically the invitation is, and how do you fit in with that? So that the parable takes people on this narrative arc from what's been said and redone, suppose NLP, other language, reframing, then an opportunity for people to disassociate and associate in and out and relate it to themselves. And then the loop is opened, and then it closes the loop at the other end. Now, how does that apply to you? And of course, that's an art form, and it doesn't have to take very long, but actually the use of parables, memes, in modern culture, the use of all that is actually drives a lot of human culture. And certainly in my work in what is called track 2 diplomacy, which when people like me are asked to go and talk to people of interest to whatever organization, group or state, And it's not totally deniable, but you're not associated with us to do the pre-talks before people get together. Particularly if you're talking across ideological boundaries. Now, we're not just talking dogmatic religion, but we're talking ideological boundaries, full stop. You know, extreme left, extreme right, up, down, anywhere in the middle, throw religion into that, throw versions of capitalism, throw versions of communism into there. Actually, to find a shared narrative amongst the group can actually cut through so much time and unnecessary misunderstanding just by establishing a shared language and a shared story. And effectively, you using parables helps people go the value hierarchy to find out what is the most important thing that everybody agrees on here. Then we can define it, and then the conversation can take place. It's staggeringly powerful. Sermon over.
Excellent. Take that off the list. Metaphors. We covered this a little bit in lesson 1 by giving the example of big doors swing on little hinges, and you gave an example and I gave a way it could be used therapeutically so people could see these things are adaptable. But it's a big part of storytelling, metaphors can be.
Yeah. And for me, the use of metaphor is like, I mean, it's happening in language all the time. It's like parables on speed. You know, it is as fast as possible to get to the emotional creative center of the mind. So say, for example, somebody is stuck. They've got a complex problem. And from a logical point of view, we may say, okay, let's go step by step. It's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. And we may reach roadblocks because the personal narrative or belief says, no, that's too complicated. I can't work it out, etc., etc. You can use a simple metaphor saying, hey, you've got a piece of rock in front of you, and inside that rock is the solution. Why don't you sorting this out is like knocking everything from the rock that doesn't look like the solution. So what would that be? Then it unlocks the creativity because we now bypass the critical thing that says you've got to do this, this, and this. And all of a sudden people are in this right brain creative space where they're saying, I can visualize knocking everything away from the rock that doesn't look like the solution inside. And all of a sudden it releases solutions in the midst of complexity. It's a great way of getting people unstuck. Easy peasy, I think.
And you can use that in various situations, but from a therapeutic point of view, there's a lot of that going on in the different sections of my complete mind therapy approach. Okay. Whether it's visualizing a TV set, destroying images of things that bothered them in the past, or a magic mirror, going into the future and imagining being the perfect them. It's like loads of different mini metaphoric stories linked together, which is why I often say it doesn't particularly matter if so-called hypnosis is in place or not, because as long as they're taking part in the story, emotionally engaged, then arguably they are hypnotized. Anyway.
But here's something that I think might be really, really useful for, I mean, it's something that I find useful and it might be useful for other people, is people can get, in my experience, and I've worked with loads of people, trained people, I've been an operator, all that kind of stuff. People get overly caught up with specificity. Oh, if I don't say it in the right order, if I don't get it quite right, it's not going to work. And oh no, my attack vector into influencing somebody is that I haven't bracketed it right. The truth of the matter is that that's a projection. That's, you think that actually the person is listening to you is picking up on all the details in the way that you think they should. The reality is that once somebody, either through parable, metaphor, imagery, actually once that's gone in, you have lost people a bit, to be honest with you, because now their brain is pattern matching, they're thinking, they're musing, they're pondering, they're visualizing, they're feeling. Don't for one moment, as good as I think I might be, I must be realistic and say, actually, People are beginning to do most of the work for me once the setup is there and the image has gone in and the parable's on the go. They're now thinking about that because it's much more interesting than me anyway. Let's just be honest. It's way more interesting because now, and that's where I want them to be. I want them to be off on the journey of meaning making and pattern matching and resolving and moving in a direction. I don't want them thinking, have you said all the right words, Paul? Because they're just not. I'm not thinking that when I'm watching TV or a film. There are periods of time when I couldn't tell you what was taking place because I'm off on one. I'm visualizing, I'm thinking, and that's exactly the same. So let's just lower the bar of expectation a heck of a lot. Even though there's a lot of information that you and I, Jonathan, are going to be sharing, the reality is that different ones of us are going to take different bits, say, oh yeah, that's useful, I'm going to use that, park the rest for a bit, because they will have a disproportionate impact. They will be the small hinge that the big door swings on. Shameless metaphor.
Excellent. NLP refers to magic stories, which, as I said, I'm going to give the NLP practitioner manual so people can elaborate more, mention more in Joseph Crown's book that I mentioned before. But essentially, in a nutshell, it's what people may have heard of as being Ericksonian type hypnosis, covert hypnosis. The idea of telling a story that appears at a conscious level to have nothing to do with the issue the therapeutic client has come for, or nothing to do with the person in front of you changing their viewpoint or position on something in a different context, but that has hidden meaning that the unconscious, subconscious picks up on and makes sense of because of our ingrained view and things. I mean, I suppose this is very much what fairy tales kind of rode back to that again, the fact that things are perceived and reacted upon differently on a conscious level to the unconscious emotional level. Okay.
So in my world, so there's somebody I'll talk to and they'll be like, some of that may or may not work in terms of, let me tell you a story that doesn't seem to relate to anything of this, and then your mind will make connections so that then it influences you about the this, whatever the this is. Maybe because I haven't deployed it, I don't know. But one thing I do know is that you can seed and establish a principle that you can cross over with. Now, let me give you an example. So say, for example, I'm wanting to establish, this is a value that is valuable that we'd want to use across A, B, and C setting. We prefer this kind of behavior. But I don't want to hit that directly, because if I use push language, you must do this, you must do that, I'm going to hit resistance. So I need to third party. And sometimes I can say, look, in certain situations that we go into, we valued X, Y, and Z. And we don't say, so we want you to do that, or we expect you to do that. But actually, that's where I'm going, because I'm seeding in them that people that are successful do this kind of stuff, and I'm putting it out there and they're just taking it in, because my expectation is I'm not closing everything in that situation. I might have a 2 weeks, 2 months, or a year of relationship building and operations. So I'm going to start to stack those principles and see that way of working, that way of looking at the world in somebody else's narrative by talking about somebody over there and how we do things that are really good. And eventually, it's suggestion, isn't it? Gradually, they get to know my ways of working and what we find appropriate in other situations, and now they want a piece of that. That's probably as close as I get to the Ericksonian storytelling stuff that doesn't seem to have any direct implication on the present situation, but has everything hidden within it that gives you the solutions. I guess that's where they're going with it. But I would use it, and probably in a seeding and establishing a principle. And that's how I would do it.
you say seeding, but also another word, I don't mean slightly different, but relevant, priming.
Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, Cialdini's second book, you know, his seminal book on influence, his second one on persuasion, that you know, we're priming. I know Darren Brown uses a lot of priming in terms of setting up tricks, and mentalists are, you know, they're using a lot of these priming things to prepare people. Joe Navarro, the FBI guy, they use a lot of priming in terms of color and temperature and dress and choreography of a room. As you walk through the offices to the main room that you're going to be in, it's all set up, and the artwork and the quotes that are up on the wall and all that kind of is priming, seeding, and establishing people and thoughts, so that when we meet, a lot of the work is done because we've logged that in our, as you call it, your personal neck-top computer. We're logging that here because our brain is pattern matching, saying, oh, I like that, I don't like that, I agree with this, I agree with that. Oh, I might not necessarily agree with that, but that looks very successful, and I'm more driven by success than I am about something else. So I think I might imbibe some of that and subconsciously say yay. And even the way you set the room up as well, you're priming people in terms of who sits first, how they sit, where they sit, the angles they sit at. But obviously that's not to do with storytelling, but that's priming in general.
You say it's not to do with storytelling, but it could be in a theatrical sense. It certainly would be in terms of a stage play, or, you know, the difference of where the actor sits is kind of the same as in the theatre of the boardroom or such.
Yeah. I mean, and there's, if you want to get really funky on this, proxemics and heptatics and all that kind of stuff about positioning and distance, there's a lot of fascinating research on it about how you position people, where you sit them. You know, when we sit people in a triangle configuration in the room, so the person talking, your target, is not having to move their head so much, they're uncomfortable, it's in their peripheral vision. When you're talking to somebody, if you're meeting in a restaurant or something, you want to sit them at a particular angle, and you want to look at their left eye because of cross hemisphere matching, which if we look in the left eye is connected to the right hemisphere, which is more creative and all that kind of jazz. So I think Oregon State University did some research on this, and they kind of tentatively suggested that actually looking into the left eye creates a greater sense of connection, as self-reported by other people, than if you look in the right eye when you're talking to somebody. So there is so much mad stuff out there, that people who are trying to stack as many things in their favor through priming, choreography, use of props, are using in order to just be the difference that makes the difference. You know, that small tipping point, to use a metaphor, to get people to say yes, resistance drop, whatever it is, even down to, you know, and I do this as well, you go in and you shake somebody's hand. If you're very sensitive to the person, you can feel the grip strength, whether they're slightly turning or pulling or whatever, and it can begin to give you indicators of how dominant that person is, proximity around how close they want you to be, and you can use that as useful cues to know how to take the conversation and how embracing they want to be or not. But you've got to be on it to pick up on all those cues. And quite frankly, sometimes I'm too nervous and too tired. So I'm going with the macro simple stuff.
Hey, good man. I'm sure people will appreciate that, but it's nice to give them some background as well. So I'm just going through and ticking things off. No. As I say, all of these subjects are covered more in the NLP manual or the book by Joseph Crown that people could order if they wanted. But as you also say, we will have mentioned enough, even though we might only give you one or two examples, and it might seem too simplistic. The point is that in our experiences, keeping it simple as the simplistic examples we're giving is actually that which is most effective and usable in the real world, because you don't forget to do it and whatnot.
100%. And I think in a highly technological, knowledge-based system, which most of us operate in, and knowledge has primacy, we can confuse simplicity with stupidity, and it's not the same. True genius is knowing how to take something quite complicated and say, we can make it more simple, bite-sized chunks of actually, and it's the Pareto principle, it's the 80-20, 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts and your input. I know way more than I can use, and I'm good at using lots of things, but that's no good to most people, because working memory says I can hold 5 bits of information plus or minus 2. So what is the difference that's going to make the difference? So I say to people, expose yourself to as many of these techniques and ways of doing things as possible, and then start with the ones that you are really intrigued by, that you've got the balls to use, try them, get quick feedback, because you'll get it from the situation, and say, hang on a minute, that really works. And then start to build. And you'll find that over time, these other skills will move from conscious competency, which feels clunky, to unconscious competency, which is just really quick and it's part of who you are. So yeah, just relax, enjoy the journey.
I have written down next nested loops, which is a name given by neurolinguistic programming to a technique that really good comedians and storytellers have used for years. One British, well, actually Scottish comedian who, not all of his work, but a large amount of his works, great examples of what NLP called nested loops, is Billy Connolly.
Yeah.
But people can find on YouTube if he's a Scottish comedian. And what this technique is, my brief explanation, as I say, there's more in the manuals, is the idea that you start telling a story where people can see, the end's in sight, and you're very nearly at the end, but then suddenly you go up, it appears as though you've gone off on one, because you're telling the story and it might be about a person, but then near the end, where the conclusion will be about what happened to that person, you suddenly go, oh, and do you know what that reminds me? That when they were at that place, they also saw, and it ends up being about this person they saw there, and a second story starts. So you haven't finished this one off. That loop's still left open. And then another one's open, but when that appears to be nearly at an end, suddenly, oh, and there was that there, which reminds me of, and you can open up multiple stories. And what this does is make people end up, they might not consciously be thinking it, although I have been in situations where this has been done badly and ended up thinking, for fuck's sake, just, I want to know what happened at the beginning, let alone these other bits. Can you just close it? But it's supposed to make that happen at an unconscious level of, come on. So that then, after there's 3 or 4 of these loops opened and set off, you then start closing them down in reverse, is one way of doing it, so that they've had to wait longest for the original thing to be closed. Okay. So there's a sense of fulfillment and relief and satisfaction of finding this out, which in comedy can be used at, also that's where the punchline is, or there might be a punchline everywhere, but this is the biggest punchline that might also then relate back to all the other things, where it then becomes clear, actually, all of these things are actually interlinked, and this person wasn't an annoying job going off on one, but actually blended together this wonderful story and narrative with meanings on so many levels.
Wow. Okay. So let me give you, from a practitioner's point of view, we probably wouldn't have called it that, but let's use that language. So say, for example, our viewers, they're developing a business. They got to go to networking events. Most people are like, oh my gosh, networking events. I've got to go to a trade fair. I've got to go to wherever they find themselves, where they've got a product that they're really proud of. There might be a therapist, there might be somebody in business therapy, whatever they are. And they've got to get a product over to people. And they're thinking, oh my gosh, I got to network and I hate it. Part of training people, there's some physical things that we can talk through as well, about how you watch for feet and all this kind of stuff, how to break in and out conversations, and the forced teaming. But open and closed loops are an absolute gift. So it works on the premise that people like to feel seen, heard, and understood, safe, etc. So you go to your networking event, top tip, never talk to people as they're going to the bar or the food, because they want to get that. Talk to them after they've got their food and they're walking away, or stand with them in the queue and use the forced teaming thing about food, etc. Now, once you're in conversation with people, this is where open and closed loops work really, really well. You've set your expectation of, right, I'm in the conversation, I've used your stories, your metaphor, whatever, your conversational hypnosis, whatever phraseology we want to use for that. And you've reached your goal, and your goal is a referral. So don't push it any further, enjoy the networking event, but you want to get away from them and you can't get away. Now, the way that you can use open and closed loops is really simple in that setting. You need to do both of these. Otherwise, if you just do the first one, you feel like they think you're an idiot. You say, hey, Jonathan, it's really great to talk. There's somebody I know over there. It assumes you know somebody, but let's take that as given. There's somebody I know would be fascinated in talking to you. Let's go over there right now. So I take you over to the other person. You're expecting me just to walk away. And that would be rude, because that's a common brush off in a networking situation. We used open and closed loops. We use bracketing around this. So I would say to Jonathan, whoever you're talking to, oh, it's really great. Listen to what Jonathan's got to say. Ding, 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 ding. And I'll tell you what, I will be back in 5 minutes to see how you folk are doing. So what I'm doing is I am opening a loop and I'm giving a time frame around it in a networking setting. And then I'm going to somebody else. Then I've got the opportunity to that somebody else to say, hey, there's somebody over there that I've just introduced. I'm just going to go and check on how they're doing. So I'm opening, closing loops. And from a networking perspective, as long as you've got your threshold of I want referrals and this, that, and the other, you can work the room using the body language and the psychology in a networking, and people do this in embassies when they're trying to turn people and make friends. You're using multiple open and closed loops in a networking situation. And also you look like to everybody else in the room that you've got a lot of power, because in a networking situation, if you're the one who's moving around introducing to people, hell, you're important. That's the person. And then you've got all sorts of other effects taking place where people
prestige, authority,
all of that,
people,
all that wonderful
or
stuff.
rapport, people want to be associated, so are more likely to seek you out.
Yeah. And the other top tip, and because we're on the network and using open and closed loops, if you are in a situation, and I've used this many times when you're trying to break in and out of situations, and for whatever reason, you're not feeling very confident, or you just think, I just don't want to network. But my business relies on it, or my reaching an asset relies on it. I use the assumptions in the room to drive my outcomes. Now, what do I mean by that? Number one, you identify the people or the person who has set the networking event up, because the assumption is that a successful networking event is where everybody feels networked. So I go to the person with the power and I leverage the power. And I might say, if it's Jonathan's networking event, I might go to Jonathan and say, yeah, Jonathan, I wonder if you'd be so kind as to introduce me to one or two of the people you think that would be good for me to talk to. Jonathan is very, very unlikely to say no to me. Why? Because his outcomes are measured by whether he's got successful networking. Number two, I've loaded him up with some patter, which for social norms makes it difficult for him to say no. I wonder if you would be so kind as to introduce me to. The assumption is if he doesn't, he is unkind, and people who run networking events don't want to be known as unkind. You see how this stuff works. Let's keep it really simple here. And Jonathan will network me in. He will let the power in the room do the heavy lifting for you. He will network me in, and he's not going to say, here's Paul, he's an idiot, he wants to talk to you, because that's not going to work either. He's maybe, just maybe, going to say some nice things. So for those of you watching who are like, I need to network, that's how you use open and closed loops to network, and how you use the psychology of the power and the assumptions in the room to get you in and out of situations without you having to do much work at all. And for an introvert who plays at being an extrovert, that's been an absolute gift to me. End of story on networking.
That's gold.
It works a treat. It works a treat.
So that is gold. So right, still got some more on this list. Here we go. We have covered it, so this won't take long, but it's because this specifically we're still in the rounds of storytelling. Symbolism.
Yeah.
There is that which has associated meaning because people look at it and go, oh, that's mystical, or it's old, or it's magical looking. And then there's that which is part of popular culture. The idea of images, logos.
Yeah. So that's used a lot. So a friend, an acquaintance. So I think is it SCL, CSL, the parent SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. He used to work.
Yes.
And he's a whistleblower at very, very high levels, national stuff. And he said, we just used loads of symbolism, cultural tropes, norms, and symbolism to bypass and get to people really quickly. Just put words under it. Now, in the everyday world where we might not be using that, there are other symbols that we can use as authority amplifiers. The symbolism, stuff like the watch you wear, the rings on your finger, the bag you carry, the the clothing you put on, the stuff on your wall, the weight of material that you give to people symbolizes authority and strength. All the research around weighty pens, heavy grade paper, stuff that's got, that's sharp edged or soft on the edges. So you've got big metacultural symbols like the third eye, a triangle, whatever it is, and you'll see those in lots of videos, etc. You'll have lots of symbolism around loads of people walking across a border and a sign under it saying don't let these people in. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. You've got symbolism which provokes and evokes stuff. You've got symbolism from World War II, from both the German side and the Allied side. All that symbolism plays in left, right, and center. But right down to little old me and you walking into situations, what we want to do is find who is your target, who is your audience, and therefore what symbols are going to be an authority and a credibility amplifier for us. And then we intentionally, as with all this stuff, we use those to stack things in our favor. Simple as that. So that's why in some settings, I'll wear a really expensive suit. Hope I don't get any mess on it as I'm going through London, but I wear an expensive suit because I'm in a situation where people need to wear expensive suits, and other times it's jeans and a t-shirt. It's still the same me, but it's how it goes.
And some might seem to some an extreme example, but some people would perhaps do prior research on the people they were going to meet, which these days is increasingly easy with social media and whatnot, to find out what that person likes, and find out things like what sexuality they are or what clubs they're a member of.
Yeah.
So you may then purchase a small pin badge that just happens to have a certain logo on it.
Yeah.
That could be like, that shows you're an ally to LGBT. And wear it, and you don't say anything about it, but knowing that that person's going to recognize that, and without having to say anything, you're not walking into a meeting going, hey, slap on the back, I'm all for LGBTQ plus rights. And you're sending out this non-verbal signal in this example, the person will pick up, and that in itself can strike this rapport.
That's huge. It's huge. I mean, the amount of places I've been into where, so two things. Number one, before I meet somebody important, I will profile their linguistic profile. And this, we'll talk about this another time as well. And NLP's grabbed a hold of this, but how can you intentionally use that to know how to frame and phrase your correspondence and your opening patter and your conversational dynamic? You've got loads of information. The internet's wonderful for that. All open source, no sneaky beaky stuff. The other thing that I notice a lot of as well, because I'm in and out of various offices, is that the materials that are put down on the coffee table or the reception or in the boardroom various magazines and newspapers are strategically picked for the audience that they are catering for. And so if you've got a therapy room, if you've got whatever it is with your business, the choreography is really, because there's symbolism in the periodicals that you may choose. If you've got a plasma screen TV, the stuff that you have rolling on there is important. The colors that you use symbolize different things as well. Green for healing and therapy, royal blue for authority, purple for royalty. Whatever you're seeking to achieve and establish, you can set all these things up to aid you in your endeavors.
Nice. Next on the list, embedded commands. I'm going to give a couple of examples. These can be things that are weaved within the story, so that they're not consciously picked up on, but apparently will be unconsciously. So, but in therapy, I might say to somebody, as you lie there now with your eyes closed, relaxing more with every breath that you take, every noise that you hear, every word that I say, and every thought that you think. I don't know if you want to go into a trance now or in a few moments' time, but go into a trance, you will, just as rapidly as feels right. And that, on one level, just sounds like I'm waffling stuff that's gonna is part of this important seeming ritualistic process. However, and I overemphasize, I didn't massively pantomime overemphasize it, but I did emphasize it a bit more than I probably would do in a real session. Now I'll pantomime it. So, although it seems like I'm just saying things slowly, sort of as you lie there with your eyes closed and relax deeply, breathing deeply in through your nose and then out through your mouth. With every breath you take, every noise you hear, every word I say, and every thought that you think. I don't know if you want to go into a trance now or in a few moments' time, but go into a trance. You will, just as rapidly as feels right for you. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do it like that, but you can play the video back and see that it was far more subtle the first time. The idea is that I think they call it phonetic marking, or
oh yes, analog marking using physical things.
I've raised my voice ever so slightly upwards, or you can do it the other way, so it's slightly quieter for certain bits. And those bits were go into a trance now. At a conscious level, if there's still any resistance prior to getting critical faculty bypass, it would be perceived that we're saying, I don't know if you want to go into a trance now or in a few moments' time, but go into a trance, you will, just as rapidly as feels right for you. Because that was all said at exactly the same level. But if there's a minute difference in the go into a trance bit, that becomes an embedded command or embedded suggestion that is not consciously, is not critically analysed because it's hidden in a sentence and thus can go straight through. So real world style, it would be, I don't know if you want to go into a trance now or in a few moments' time, but go into a trance, you will all the same, just as rapidly as feels right for you. Ever so slight difference in volume, but also a slight pause before and after. Not that they go, what the fuck's going on, but so that it marks it. So it's a command, a suggestion that's embedded within the sentence, hence they're called embedded commands.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I got a funny story on that. I was at a party with loads of people. It was a party, and there was somebody there who had done a conversational hypnosis course with somebody who was quite well known in that world, I believe. And it just sounded like they couldn't talk properly. You know, they were trying to do all this stuff, and I was like, it sounded like the sentence full stops were all over the place. And they were really clunky at it. Now,
that's because they do it way too obviously. They take it too literally. You've got to be as close to normal conversation.
Yeah, the research is interesting. So a lot of, I don't know if it's so much in the UK, but there are insurance companies that use voice stress analysis software. So when you've got an inbound call, and they'll do that interview settings as well. So if there's, in certain settings, they'll they'll have voice stress analysis. It's not to catch people lying. All these things are polygraphs. They're not lie detectors. They're biofeedback mechanisms, which in the hands of a skilled operator, they know what to look and hear for. And the science gives them some insight that might bypass their normal senses anyway. But voice stress analysis is interesting because the hertz levels and the volume levels are picked up very subtly. So when somebody is stressed because they are overexcited or withholding or lying or whatever they are, you will imperceptibly, but perceptively, so we can know that we're hearing it, but we know that we're hearing it at a deeper level. We will hear different pitch and volume changes in conversation. And when you're going through the switchboard or being analyzed in a situation, they will know that actually there's that hertz level in the voice, which demonstrates high levels of stress or withholding. And we need to ask questions there, and there. So that's how the technology is used for the science here. But certainly when it comes to communication, everybody, well, not everybody, but people know if you want to be an effective communicator, the limbic system moves towards and opens up to what it likes. So you can trigger somebody to auditory and physically move towards you by when you're giving your pitch or your spiel, just drop the volume at key points because people lean into to hear more effectively. And of course, we're triggering something positive. Hey, that's interesting. And we're just dropping the volume. So there's things that we can do with tonality and marking, which I suppose is around embedded commands, which got some really good science behind it. But you just got to be really good at it. Otherwise, you sound like a lunatic.
Yeah, you sound like a complete nut, and it'll have the direct opposite effect. I mean, one of my favourite ones therapeutically is when you're allegedly hypnotising someone and they're apparently going to go unconscious. They don't. Of course they're not. We won't get into that state argument. But it's one of the ones, I suppose this could come under ambiguity as well, saying something that could have multiple meanings. But as you're now so deeply relaxed, so deeply asleep, from this moment forward, I'm talking to your unconscious now. And that's like that. So I'm talking to your unconscious now, but the slight volume increase or change is on your unconscious now, implying that they're in a different state. Could arguably under which interestingly, the next section is 4 in 1. Ambiguity, things that can have double meaning. So there, or phonetic ambiguity can sound there, or punctuation ambiguity, syntactic ambiguity, in other words, pauses, words meaning similar in layman's terms. That can be an element as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the truth for me, in my experience of being out and about talking to people, is I'm aware of these things, and this is not false humility, I just wasn't good enough if there was such a thing as good enough or not good enough, able to deploy these to their most effective use. Some other people may be able to better than me, or it may be more suited to their therapeutic environment. However, using silence and pauses is super powerful. And somebody said to me, and it's a metaphor, let the silence do the heavy lifting. So you say something, and if you're a verbal processor by nature, you want to fill the atmosphere up with noise. When it comes to elicitation, rapport building, neurosynchrony, all that kind of stuff that we're talking about, actually just pausing just a bit longer than you'd naturally feel, just letting silence and actually allow the person to come back up at you with something, and they will begin to share more. And when they've stopped sharing, hold back a bit longer, let the silence do the heavy lifting, because they're still processing. Because most of us aren't thinking about what the other person is thinking about. Most of us are thinking about what we're going to say next. And that's taking place, people. So you allow a little bit of silence, and that person will start talking about maybe what they're thinking next, and give way more away in an intelligence setting than you first anticipated. But certainly in a therapeutic setting, maybe the real reason comes out because we've allowed some space. And then they tell us a bit more. And that tell me a bit more is, oh, there are the goodies.
Next on the list. Well, actually, I'm going to cover 2 at the same time because they interlink. We've got subliminal influence and spatial anchoring. So I'm going to I give quite a few examples of these in the rapid seduction course that I'm going to give our INS students and delegates access to. This is such a false environment, so it's going to appear unnatural.
Jonathan.
Oh, but, it's the cliche. You're in the club or something. Nice to meet you. Do you come here often? Because I'm figuring you do. Blah blah blah. You get a response. Whatever. You've got to be having a normal conversation, and then you can just throw in something like, you know what? I bet that you, like me, really love when they put the certain kind of music on it, whatever. You fill it in at the end. You make it contextually relevant, obviously, the point I'm trying to make. But as a link between things into whatever nonsense you're going to talk about, subliminal and spatial anchoring by movement of things. You, and I'm pointing at them, you probably, like me, and I pointed towards myself, I nodded, like me, probably like the music that the other DJ that comes on at 9 o'clock, and because it's apparently just a normal conversation and it innocently flies by, but within there you've got you, like me, but the trouble is there are people who go on courses and do this and leave way too much pauses, and the woman or man they're trying to do it to, depending on the sexuality, just goes, no, actually I fucking don't. I don't even know who you are. because it becomes too obvious. All right? It's got to be casual and flowing, Hey, bloody hell, finally they served me at the bar. Sorry about that. I tell you what, I bet you, like me, prefer the DJ that's on at 9 o'clock, or do you prefer this guy? It doesn't particularly matter whether they say they prefer this, because you've still got in there the you, like me. And you can look at their non-verbal cues. As long as you do it subtly enough that they don't consciously go, no, I fucking don't, they will unconsciously pick up on it. And if there's any element of interest, if they would be interested in you in an element, their non-verbals will give you those clues.
Yes.
Just as their non-verbals will give you the clue of if it would be a waste of time.
Yeah, very much. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to the INS stuff, we're talking about rapport building, trust. What ultimately, I suppose this is NLP talk and when we're modeling what successful relationships and connections look like, they have structure to them. They have a set of qualities, whether verbally, non-verbally, tonally, spatially, etc. So we're basically breaking that process down. And ultimately, what I am after and what we are after and what we observe in great relationships is when my wife looks at me, she has a good feeling. So she attaches a good feeling to me. And that's all we're doing when we're relating to people. We want to trigger, actually, when they see Jonathan, when they see Paul, or whoever you are watching and listening to this, that when that person looks at you, they equate that with something that feels nice. And when something feels nice, we move from A to B, the resistance is down, etc. And it's all wonderful and it's good and it's how fantastic relationships go. But there is a structure, and therefore it can be slightly engineered. And some people are very good at knowing how to engineer this stuff, and others of us are still learning.
You never stop learning. In spatial anchoring, a couple of examples there. One is if you're doing a public talk, and I cover this in the public speaking videos I'm going to give people access to, that I would tend to stand at one side of the stage or one area of the stage when I'm talking about negative things, hurtful things, scary things, and wanting to leave things well and truly in the past, whereas I stand somewhere else on the stage when I'm talking about positive, the future, and whatnot, so that then as that, without verbally telling people that's what's happening, they get anchored to that space, that area, and spatial anchoring is all to do with good things, or this is all to do with bad, so that later on something that they currently think of as bad, we can start talking about here, and then start walking gently So we end up in the central, neither good nor bad area, where we verbally will talk about the possibility of change, perhaps, or the company moving forward and achieving something, or reaching the goals that the group wants to, or whatever. So we start to entertain a possibility, but they're kind of arguably in a theta state, because it's neither, there's an element of confusion. This is neither bad nor good at the minute.
Yeah.
And then as we give our vision of what the future will hold because of doing X, Y, and Z, we walk towards the good area where they've already got the good feelings associated as we end up, because then it's more likely that they'll feel an amplification of that positive state being elicited and anchored and triggered. And that's a way it's used in public speaking, which yeah.
I mean, it's very powerful. And, you know, say, for example, let's even boil it down even further. So in public speaking, it's great. You can use your hands and do all that kind of jazz. And we've been doing that as we've been talking. If you're one-to-one and you're in a selling or a closing environment, or you're trying to persuade somebody to move from A to B, this isn't just the realm of NLP eye accessing cues. We're not saying that when they move their eyes there, it always means this. Let's just keep it even simpler than that, because we're operating slightly nervous in a pressurized environment. So we want stuff that we can barely have to think about and we can just do, so we know the principles. If I'm sitting with somebody and they're talking about something positive and they keep looking in yay direction where that is, I'll log it. If they're talking about something that's irritating, they're looking in nay direction, I'll log it. So now when I say, and actually we're doing this, this, and this, it's up where they're looking positive. I don't care whether it's, you know, linguistic forward, backwards, auditory.
So by you gesturing in the direction, you've noticed that they look for positive. You can, when you want them to feel good about what you're saying, gesture in that direction, thus forcing them to look that way, and thus attaching that feeling.
100%. And, you know, that even goes into some of the emerging research. It's been around for years, but it's becoming more public knowledge now around how some of these psychotherapeutic somatic techniques work, like brain spotting, EMDR, multi-channel eye movement integration, all that kind of stuff that say actually they're using eyes moving or holding in one position, but we're basically taking that because there's the connection between the eye and the brain, to the brain stem, to the brain, in terms of how we process. So what we're doing is, hey, I basically, layman's terms for me, basically I'm telling myself, hey, I saw Jonathan looking in that direction when he was happy, so our product is going to do this, this, and this over here, and actually our competitors are bang, bang, bang. Now, once you start to connect that with linguistic markers as well, in terms of whether they're, I suppose, in general semantics or NLP terms, visual, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic, whatever else, amplifier language, predicates, blah, 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 blah. Once you start to weave those in, that begins to be quite sophisticated and powerful. And you can do it in email form as well. So you can find out how people linguistically structure positive and negative, and then email them if you're in a business relationship. But this spatial anchoring works a treat. And you'll be able to see, if you're close enough, somebody's pupils will dilate. They're taking more light in. Wow. Yeah. And then that gives you, and if you're getting really funky on the body language, Fipsy would be great on this, is you look if there's any skin tone discoloration here, or if you sit at an angle and somebody's head there, you can see increases in heart rate, which is arousal, positive or negative.
He does indeed talk about such things in the body language training that we're going to give the INS students access to.
Yeah.
And so it can be on a stage that the anchor is, or it can be in the air with your hands, like you just did, or it could be an object movement. In the seduction package that we're going to give INS people access to, I talk about using my drink if I'm sat opposite somebody, if I was in taking them for a meal, and this would work business-wise, not just for dating and getting your leg over. That in a non-verbal manner, there's a line at the center of the table. So that half's their territory, this half's my territory. But the closer my glass gets to the center of the table, the closer it's getting to the neutral area. If I was to overgo that without permission, it'd be intrusive. Now, normally we keep our glass roughly near us, about halfway from the halfway line. When you taken a drink, you can put it down so it's now 2/3 of the way from your body towards being at the central line, and observe, is there any uncomfortable body language or change of rhythm, speed, volume, pitch, voice, anything that goes, not comfortable with that. If there's no discomfort signs coming, next time you took a drink, a bit closer to the central line. And over the next 5-10 minutes, if you don't get any resistance, you gently settle it so it's part at the bottom of the glass over their half, part over yours. Invariably, if they're not interested in you in a dating arena, they won't even know they've done it. They'll just move the glass back slightly. If they let you keep putting it then back down into their half without even realizing it, you want other signals as well, always clusters. One thing alone does not guarantee success make, but generally speaking, it's that they're accepting your idea, which in the dating arena is the idea of perhaps, you know, spending more time with you, getting to know you better. Or in a business meeting is the idea they're accepting the proposal you're putting forward. So it can also be object movement and placement, can't it?
Yeah, it's huge. There's great research around that as well, Jonathan, around object movement. I mean, as you were talking there, I think one of the most underused but powerful markers in relationships is beginning to match somebody's breathing patterns. That has, and anybody, you know, who's modeled lovers, people who are in deep rapport, deep friendships, they begin to breathe at the same rate. And you can begin to match that in somebody else. Be careful how you use it. It can be really that influential in terms of getting a sense of connection to somebody.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because next on the list is the bullet point of pacing and leading.
Yeah.
And now breathing's one way of doing that, which is what you just alluded to, but it can also be done through movements as well, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. Movements, pace, speed that somebody talks, the cadence. Do they talk in da 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 or da 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 da? You know, so you're matching that. But ultimately, we want to get to a place where we are leading, where we are segueing from all the powers with them to actually getting the power to flow through them to the direction that we would deem as the most useful place for them to be. And that's not from a bad perspective. That can be from a positive perspective, a therapeutic exchange where we're wanting to get somebody from a particular state of anxiety into a trust state, so then we can move them to the wholeness state. You know, so I can understand how that can work in a therapeutic setting, not just in the world of whatever else you want to apply it to, but that's really important. And breathing, using our body language to mirror there. It's not sort of like really obvious and all that, but a bit more subtle. But
I'm glad you said that, because next on the list is mirroring and matching. Now, the thing is, mirroring and matching quite often interlace with pacing and leading, because you mirror, which is observe the individual's body movements, but then copy it, duplicate it on the opposite side with your body, like a mirror image, hence it's called mirroring. Matching is that down the line, after you've done it mirrored for a while, so if they move their left hand, you do it with your right. Not in a mimicking fashion. This is going to be done subtly with a bit of a gap, otherwise they just think you're fucking crazy. Is that once you're kind of in that mirrored state, you can then consciously move to the next level of matching and doing it on the same side, which would be classed as en rapport, as it were. But that, which also arguably is pacing them, because you're getting into their pace. But then you can take it the direction you want, which is leading, by once you're in harmony with them for a while, if you slightly increase your breathing, the chances are they will follow.
Yeah, so
you know,
And that, you know, I'm pulling back something, gosh, I don't know if what's my experience? I'm aware of all these things. So under pressure, under stress, I have found no difference in whether I mirror or match them exactly. Now, that just might be me. It might be I'm bringing all sorts of other things into the equation that are unmeasurable, that are influencing that. So when they move, I move. Now, it's whether if they move their hand up in the air, I'm not going to necessarily do that. But it's just I find that when there's movement, I move as well, and just keep it as simple as that. So if they cross their arms, I'm not saying going to cross my arms. I might just move. And because when it comes to high levels of conflict and confrontation, sometimes people are more comfortable not sitting down for it and actually walking or having visibility to an exit point and this, that, and the other. So in my other world, we may be having a conversation. I'm moving with them, you know, they're moving whatever, and I'm matching it in terms of the matches movement with movement, regardless of what it is, as long as it's not macro, it's just small and subtle. And I'm building that. When it gets to the crescendo of tension, there's two things that I'm going to do. Number one, I'm literally going to break the angle. Now, if it's on Zoom, I'm going to pull back or move to the side. And that gives people that feeling of I can get past Paul, not that he's very big anyway, but I can get past Paul so I feel safe. And you can do that in a meeting setting as well, because then where I want to go, if it gets to the real height of the crescendo, but we need to take place, I want them to now obey me. So I will suggest, what are we going for a walk? And they're much more likely to yield to that request if I've been matching them through body movement and providing space and angle past me to the exit point, than if I say right at the beginning, right, let's do this meeting walking. They're like, what are you talking about? So there's that kind of rapport building of this, that, and the other, and it works a treat. And there's some nice research around actually people preferring not to have to look into each other's eyes in a confrontational setting, actually walking side by side, because you've got that break and other stimuli coming in to reduce the threat level, and you can run
away. Voice and body language, meaning that in terms of storytelling, there's a thing in acting called what is your internal script, and that the actors obviously have a script. They learn the words they're going to say, stage directions, where they're going to stand, which you might see some crossovers there with what we've been talking about, stage anchoring and whatnot. But there's also, they have really good actors do, not all actors, but really good actors will ask themselves, what's my motivation at this point in the script? Am I feeling angry when I say this? Am I happy? Am I what? And they will write almost an internal script of how they're supposed to be feeling, so that as a result, their body language, their voice tones, rhythm and pace, the things we've spoken about, amplify the believability of the script. And so it is with storytelling that if you're using it purposeful, and it's not just in the moment thing, but if you're using it purposeful, you ask yourself, well, if I'm relating this story that I've made up, but I'm passing it off as being real, how would I feel if it had really happened?
For sure.
So you've got to write an internal script so that you're more likely to naturally then give out the non-verbals and the voice tone pace. The excitement of, can you believe it? I bumped into them after 20 years.
Yeah.
So that it's more believable to the individual it's being delivered to.
Oh, no, that's 100%. So it's called embodied cognition. Again, it is absolutely vital that you live the role that you're presenting. So that's all in the rehearsal stage, and the visualization. Charles Garfield's research on peak performance about internalization, visualization, embodying it. So then you're congruent for NLP language, where everything lines up with the story that you're portraying, or the character, or whatever role you're stepping into, whether you are the hypnotist, or you are the salesperson, or you are the whatever you are. The other thing as well, for those people out there who want to get a bit more geeky in deception, detection, credibility analysis, there is a shape to truth. There are spatial and linguistic markers which are consistent 100% of the time as a quality of truth telling. And that's how people who are really snazzy at this stuff begin to pick up. So the use of pronouns, the use of the pronoun I and we, the use of how emotions are embedded into the story or not, the amount of mistakes that come in, which are, important in storytelling. It's not too perfect, by the way, and how you can use reverse questioning techniques to uncover whether a story hangs together. So you can rehearse a story wonderfully and get into character, but under questioning, if you haven't rehearsed that fictitious story by knowing how to jump around in the narrative. Oh, actually, Jonathan, that's interesting. You were talking to me about that. Could you just actually, from that moment, take me back? What was to the events leading up to that? Jumping around in the story is much harder for a deceiver than it is for a truth teller, because the truth teller is truthful, and we've coded our memories differently when it is a truthful narrative as opposed to a deceptive narrative. However, there are ways to begin to rehearse and practice our legacy story in such a way that it becomes embodied cognition. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of conversational hypnosis. That's deception detection and the shape of truth and how we're trained to develop a story.
Put the stuff out there if people want to learn about that. And hey, you know what? It's something we may cover in one of our planned potential live, in person or on Zoom advanced training events.
Get a flip chart out and show people, look, this is what it turns out, that's what the research says. And there's some very great research by Aldert Fridge and people like that who have codified all this, and there's a lot of stuff in there.
Cool. Working through my list. Some of this is definitely going to be left for the next lesson, because actually we're getting close to the end of my bullet points for storytelling, which was what this was meant to be about. There's a book suggestion here. Now, this is only for those people who want, well, either A, those people who like to know all the fancy words, or those people who just like to understand more about the science of sense and structure and language to hide suggestions and commands in. But there's a great book called The Word Weaving, W-O-R-D, Word Weaving, The Science of Suggestion, a Comprehensive Guide to Creating Hypnotic Language by Trevor Sylvester.
It's very good.
You can pick it up on Amazon, new, for about a tenner off the top of my head. Might be a bit more than that, but you regularly pick them up on eBay for £10 and less. And really, it's worth its weight in gold. That, combined with what is in Joseph's book that I mentioned before, The Art of Hypnotic Episodic Storytelling, a training manual for crafting long-form compelling narratives for influence, that Joseph Crown book and Trevor Sylvester's book together, and don't bother wasting your time reading any others. Just go out there and actually practice and see results for yourself. You'll always learn more doing these things than you will wanting to learn more about them.
Yeah.
So, which segues me to, I'm going to bring today's lesson, because that's a nice point of storytelling to end, albeit it's not an end, because stories are more effective when they've got a meaning. And to be honest, I'd heard of logotherapy, aka existential therapy, or existential psychotherapy, or as some refer to it, the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. I'd heard of these things, but it's not something I'd ever really looked into until one of my conversations with your good self. And when you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And when you mentioned to me the fact that he was a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany, and that he was a survivor of that, but some survivors, major complex post-traumatic stress disorder and other issues, whereas he found a meaning to things. And when we talked about other things, I realized that there was this crossover between the way I teach therapy and sales skills and all manner of other things in the Elite Hypnosis Bootcamp. And in that 4-hour video that we've given people with lesson 1, where I explain the Pygmalion, Galatea, and all these terms and what they really mean and how it's the underlying grassroots to everything, that it was about, a lot of it roots back to finding meaning in something. And that is a far less shocking way of explaining what I do in the boot camp, of the difference between two women, same age, same background, everything about them's identical. And then they get gang raped in exactly the same kind of manner. Why does one of them, life is ruined, just fall apart? It's just a road of unhappiness, trauma, and grief. Yet this other person, for no apparent reason, almost picks themselves up, dusts themselves off, and becomes, sets up support groups for survivors. And what is the difference that makes the difference? And when you look closely, it's that this one's turned the negative into some positive outcome and meaning to, in an almost religious sense, it was almost a sign of needing to do something to give them a sense of meaning, to make themselves feel whole and complete as a person, rather than feeling totally destroyed.
Yeah, sure.
And I realized, hang on a minute, my little bit of research I've done, I've not read the book yet, but I shall definitely be reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, is that it struck me that, hang on, this seems to have a hell of a lot of commonalities with the conclusions I come to in my own ways. And I know that you, from your therapeutic side of things, advertise as offering logotherapy. So can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, well, the snapshot version is, so I'm qualified, all that jazz in logotherapy. So if you think about the foundations for most positive psychology, Seligman stuff, CBT, a lot of the cognitive positive psychology has its roots in logotherapy. And without going into all the fundamental presuppositions and the frameworks that it use, let's put it like this. If I'm working with somebody, or Frankl or Franklin logotherapy, they work with somebody who has, say I'm working with a survivor or something, and what we would do is, people are in despair. What does it mean? Why did it happen? We don't start with why, we look at what. What can you do? Ultimate meaning, okay, might not find that, but immediate meaning. So if I'm talking to somebody who's suicidal, I will say to them, why haven't you committed suicide, for argument's sake? What would you say? Because there is going to be something that comes out of them that says, I don't do it because, keyword, because of X. And it's that X which provides them with enough meaning to stop them from doing Y. So we build from that point, as well as a whole lot of other therapeutic and psychotherapeutic things in there. When you think about meaning, what is it that motivates to do X, and what is it that stops us from doing Y? And once we can identify that, we can then build from that place. And there's all sorts of things to do with phobias and blah, 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 blah. Whole psychological background to it. So as it relates to what we're talking about, so say, for example, if you're coaching, if you're leading, if you're selling, if you're providing therapy, if you're covert hypnosis, whatever, we're basically finding out ultimately what is meaningful for somebody in that situation. So meaningful, in fact, that they are prepared to suspend other beliefs in order to accept that. They're prepared to do the hard graft in order to get that. And or that meaning is so clearly drawn out by us, the therapist, the influencer, the persuasion, the salesperson, whatever, that we can use that as the building block that we then start to work with other things, because that point of meaning is associated to pain and pleasure. And once we can trigger the pain and pleasure, we can help people move from A to B. Now, that's probably a very brutal version of describing a small section of what logotherapy can do.
It is, however, an explanation that prompts me even more to want to read the book, because the bit of research I've already done shows me there's so many crossovers with what I teach in the Elite Hypnosis Bootcamp, bizarrely.
Yeah. It's I read it, well, I'm 50 now, just about. I read it over 10 years ago, and I'm a crybaby, and I love to cry. And I remember sitting on the train, I was sitting on the floor of a packed train, reading it, crying, thinking, gosh, I feel like I come home. But the story being astonishing, but why do certain people manage to overcome in seemingly impossible situations and others don't? And he was already a psychotherapist before he went in. He was a neuroscientist, a brain scientist, a medical doctor, and a psychotherapist. You know, read Freud, met Freud, all this kind of stuff, met Adler, etc., all these other people. And he said, human beings' desire is not just for sexual liberation and repressed thoughts being released. It's not just about having more power. You can have as much of all those things as you want, but what happens if those things are also taken away? What are you left with? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? And if you can tap into that drive is phenomenal. And that can be a catalyst for all sorts of positive change. And reading that did it for me. I felt like I'd come home. It's like, and it's what we call in the trade an open systems approach. So it doesn't mean that it's saying that other stuff's rubbish. It means that actually the meaning basis, the desire, the indomitable human spirit, which wants to overcome and push ahead. Once you can tap into that, you can bring other modalities into it, but you need to get people to that place to identify what it is, draw it out, and then apply that and bring other modalities in to help them go from A to B. So it informs a lot of my work with former soldiers, special ops people, athletes who are big T, small t traumatized, actually helping them find meaning in the immediate and the ultimate so that they can move from A to B and bring the other things in. And it affects performance, but it leads to wholeness, not just I can perform better, because you can still be a wreck and perform really, really well as it's unsustainable. So yeah, read the books. Amazing stuff. Might make you cry. Get your tissues.
Excellent. And it sounds to me that the stuff we talked about in lesson 1 about finding, well, not just lesson 1, but also in the introduction, about finding people's real core values, the things that they may not even be consciously aware of, an understanding of the power of meaning obviously is going to be affected by what the person's core values are as well. And if one was able to find out those things, I guess from a non-therapeutic sense, it would also make it easier if you are in a sales scenario, a negotiation scenario.
100%.
If you can frame things so that it appears to tie in with what is truly that person's core values, or what would mean most to them in life, and make it appear as though doing X, Y, Z will lead them closer to or amplify those things that they want, that good or mean something to them, that you're more likely to get what you set out to achieve.
Oh, that's 100%. I mean, my whole approach to selling, negotiating, and therapy ultimately is doing everything I can to identify and draw out of the person what is the most valuable, meaningful thing for them, both in the immediate and the ultimate as they rebuild, if it's a therapeutic setting. Because I know that in my opinion, at least, and it's not humble because it's my opinion is the fact, I believe that's one of the most powerful drivers once you've got away from life and death. You know, okay, so what? And existentialism, you think of Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard, Viktor Frankl, Albert Camus, all these existential writers and philosophers, they said existential. It's actually something bigger and outside of myself that I live towards. What's my meaning and my purpose? And it's a non-religious sense. People from religion can take it and make it religious, but it works in a non-religious setting as well. And once I can tap into that with somebody, the selling is selling is, it's easy, to be honest, because I'm not selling something that somebody doesn't want. So I'm actually putting into words, and that's where all the stuff around linguistics and all the body language stuff, I am just trying to find the structure, physiologically, tonally, word-wise, whatever, to get my content into what is meaningful for them. And that's all I'm doing. And it can be quite quick, because you're dealing with the ultimate driver in people, and you don't need to motivate people very much once you've tapped into that for any change, because that's their natural tendency for drive and motivation. So yeah, this course is it's basically leading to that point, and how do you do the things to draw that out of people and get the change you want ethically.
A few little things before we finish for this lesson. Inside the members area, there'll be a few images, the one I showed you earlier, but also this image, which
Gotcha.
we talked about Cialdini's persuasion techniques in the last lesson. Well, there is this shortcut little logo to remind you of those different things. Also, will give you a link where you can, if you are tight-fisted, you can read his book online for free. Although for the small cost of it, I would suggest buying a copy, to be honest. There's also this, which gives you a bit of an overview of different persuasion angles, shall we say, and an explanation of what they are. But we have pretty much already covered these, although we didn't use these names for them. We have covered them in the course of the past couple of lessons. It's just that looking at this, you'll go, oh yeah, might not have covered that, but he did talk about logical use of data or appealing to credit. We have covered this stuff, so it's just a nice little sort of overview for you. And also this one. You can't quite see them all on this background, but there is one called 15 Approaches to Reach Persuasion Goals. Again, it's just a nice little overview. Pretty much all of them we have talked about. That's the thing. When you were watching or listening to these lessons, which I hope you do more than just the once, twice ideally, once to hopefully be both educated and entertained, and then a second time to take notes and take away what is truly relevant to you. But also by looking at those visual guides and some of the other stuff that you find in the members area, I'd hope it'll trigger you to go, oh yeah, you know what? They actually also did cover that. It's just that we don't always use the fancy terms. Quite often they get thrown in later by Paul because I've forgotten to mention them, or vice versa. But ultimately, none of that really matters. It's about you being able to practically use things in the real world, as Paul has said before. So with that in mind, that was storytelling. Just because I've got it in front of me, before we end, I'm just going to very quickly throw this in, because it's another book by Joseph Crown, who I mentioned earlier, who is not me. I'm telling you, Joseph Crown is not me. I'm saying that because he keeps his identity unknown, although I do know personally who he is. But this one's quite interesting because I've talked a bit about negotiation and stuff today. Again, it's a big format book and it's pretty damn cheap. This is called, as you can see on screen, Kingian Non-Violence Frameworks Training Manual, Empowering Movements for Change. Now, its intention is it's a manual to help like LGBTQ plus groups to, in a non-violent manner, get the messages across, or for political groups, or for people of certain races, colours and creeds, and that are often discriminated against, to get themselves known. But briefly, just to mention, it says on the back, because this tells you what it's about then, and why it's relevant to what we have done and are doing, is to unlock the transformative potential of non-violent activism and become a catalyst for positive social change with this comprehensive training manual rooted in the principles and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This guide empowers individuals to embrace the powerful philosophy of Kingian non-violence and create a more just and compassionate world. Prepare for action by understanding the importance of education, research, and strategic planning in driving effective non-violent campaigns. Gain insights into successful coalition building and advocacy efforts whilst embracing the values of inclusivity, empathy, and non-violent communication as essential elements for the success of your movement. And it goes on about what it'll teach you. In layman's terms, and the book is very much in layman's terms when you get inside. It just sounds a bit winky-wanky there. Prior research on your target to know what their cause, their values, their beliefs are, and being able to push the right buttons at the right times in the right ways to nudge them in the direction of the outcome you want. That is what that entire book is about, and that approach that I'm sure you've come across with it being related to Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds amazing, actually. I'm going to get myself a copy of that.
Now, he said research in there, finding out your target. In terms of research, there's a thing us magicians and mind readers use and fraudulent psychics use called cold reading. Now, cold reading is when you meet somebody cold and you apparently are able to tell them about the past, the present, the future, what motivates them, what they think, and it's on the basis of, it runs on the basis of the scam and Mr. Cheat. The scam is an acronym for travel, health, education, sex, career, ambition, and money, which are the main things most people in life will be bothered about. So if you talk about them, all of them in the course of a so-called psychic reading, the chances are you've told them what they were interested in. And Mr. Cheat is an acronym for money, relationships, career, health, education, ambition, and travel. Again, it's just memory aid of what things to talk about, apparently through looking at someone's palm. And incidentally, there's a book called Poetic Palmistry that I've included in the Seduction section for two reasons. One, because it's a great way of learning the memory aids of what the lines are supposed to mean and hand shapes and stuff, so that you can apparently tell people their past, present, and future and be the life and soul of the party. But two, in the dating seduction arena, it gives you the perfect excuse to be holding the lady's hand or the man's hand whilst giving them a palm reading, which gives you that kinesthetic touch, and with the use of the right language and anchoring, gives you the perfect excuse to anchor positive feelings to yourself. The point being, there's also a thing that psychics sometimes use, especially those that do big stage shows, or evangelical preachers like Benny Hinn do research on the congregation before they come, that's called hot reading. And in short, that could be as simple as finding the name of the person you're having a meeting with, taking their email address, running it through Google, their name, their email address, or whatever else you know about them, until you find a picture you recognize of them on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, Instagram. And from that, extrapolating information about them. Are they married? Have they got kids? Are they gay, straight, bisexual? Are they a dog or cat person? What cuisine do they most like eating? Do they butt up most? What sports are they into? Things you can observe very quickly through the photos and the things they're posting, that then gives you ammunition you can use to create an environment for negotiation or sales or seduction or whatever else that makes it easier to nudge them in the right direction.
Yeah, there's a thing in my world they do where they put photographs through filters and look at the repeated lines on faces from the repeated use of certain emotions from microfacial expressions to see which over time, it doesn't work, of course, if there's Botox, but that tells you something else, on the kind of predisposition to, you know, they frown more than they smile, to this, that, and the other. So it's yeah, there's all sorts of things going on.
Now, I'm going to let something out of the bag, so to speak, before we finish lesson 2, and that is, I am excited, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, viewers and listeners. I am excited that since lesson 1, Paul has agreed to put into the interpersonal neurosynchrony members area the videos of a thing that he briefly released a number of years ago called the Deep Tune System. It was only available to a select number of people. It's been removed off the market. You can't get it in any legal form anywhere now. However, and it's full of gold, expanding on things we've talked about and things we're yet to talk about. He's agreed that that can go into the members area. So you're going to have tons and tons of stuff. But I would urge you, don't go off on one. Watch lesson 3 and 4 and so on first before you deep dive into the Deep Tune system. So that is it for me for lesson 2.
And for me.
And from him. We'll see you in lesson 3. Take care.
Take care.